Good morning, everyone. We continue with Paramahansa Yogananda's biography, The Salient Qualities of the Master, Chapter 17. So let's start with a prayer. Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune our consciousness to your infinite presence. We are your children. Guide us, bless us, bring us home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay, my friends, so we are up to number 19. Master was respectful toward, even appreciative of others' opinions, even when these differed widely from his own. One time a disciple, Dan Boone, wrote him a scathing letter, which reflected the delusions Boone himself was going through at the time. When the master next saw him, he said to Boone, "You should take up writing. That was the best letter Satan ever wrote to me." There was no sarcasm in his voice, only admiration and respect. Now, I've been thinking about this particular quality that Master is expressing here, because there's something that there's a balance point here that is extremely important. Master was respectful and appreciative of opinions that were very different than his own. But when he spoke to Daniel Boone about this letter, now bear in mind, Daniel Boone ended up being drawn away from the spiritual path, much to his detriment. I don't want to be inaccurate, but Master said it would be many, many lifetimes before Daniel brought himself back to the point of realization that he was when he departed from the ashram. Daniel got caught up in the things that people get caught up in, and he began to think of himself as a failure. This is what happened to him because he turned his back so completely on the spiritual way of life that he began to think of himself as a failure. So he stepped into that unfortunate thing where you make an error of judgment and then you develop a complex about having made an error of judgment. And the error of judgment can be reversed just by changing your actions. But once you develop a complex about what you have done, that psychological twisting is harder to overcome than the original error of judgment. And I believe it was Daniel Boone, but it doesn't matter. The example still holds. It was one of Master's disciples who was a direct disciple and had a great deal of spiritual realization, who became tempted by the many temptations of the Western world. He spun himself out into all of those things, gave up his spiritual practices and his spiritual life. And later, when Swami saw him, what he expressed was, "Oh, I've just failed. This incarnation is over. There's just nothing that I can do." And Master must have been still living at that time, because Swami, I believe, spoke to Master about it. Master was so sad. I mean, the giving in to temptation is predictable. When you develop a definition of the self as a failure, then that takes so long to get out of again. And I believe it was in that case where Master said it would be dozens of lives. Whereas, for example, one of his very close disciples who betrayed him completely, Master said 3 more incarnations he'll be liberated. That it's not going to be, he's made a mistake. It's an error of judgment. He's repudiated what he should have embraced, but he'll get over it relatively quickly. But because Daniel, or whoever the other disciple was, embraced his weaknesses as himself, defined himself by those weaknesses, it would take much more time to work his way back. So what I'm wanting to say is that Daniel Boone really made a bad mistake, and it was a mistake that was going to take a lot of time to overcome. And still, Master didn't withdraw his friendship, but Master said that was the best letter that Satan ever wrote me. He didn't say, well, your point of view is perfectly valid. I'm going to use a phrase which some of my friends use seriously, but I can't stand it, honestly. I'm going to hold space for all these other opinions. Well, I don't think you should hold space when Satan has a hold of someone. I think you should be able to call it what it is. Now, that doesn't mean that you repudiate the friendship or that you give up hope for the person, but it's not all points of view and all actions are not equal. Some of them draw us closer to our divine happiness, and some of us lead us on the merry chase of delusion in the opposite direction from our own happiness. Why would we want to be neutral about that? When we have the discrimination to see that this person has become infatuated with a satanic idea, satanic in the sense that Satan lures us away from our true home in God. That word satanic, which is not a popular word, is a very true word. And we're not talking about someone, we're not talking about superstition. We're talking about the simple fact. That's how I experience it. I experience, and this is Master's words, as a conscious force that tries to persuade me. Swami said, Satan uses our own logic, our own false logic to persuade us of a point of view that shuts off the light and takes us into the shadow. And that's precisely what happened to Daniel. He just got involved with sensual experiences and all of the desires that he had, intoxicants and everything else. But then Satan got a further hold of him by persuading him that he was spiritually lost. Whereas the point that Master would be projecting to him is the prodigal son is welcome. It just doesn't matter. Repudiate your mistaken ideas, come back to me, and all is forgiven. I'll kill the fatted calf and have a celebration when you return. But Satan says, oh, no, you can't go back. You're just a mess. You'll never be able to do it. That's how the satanic force works. It works by insinuating itself into our mind and persuading us that it's our own thoughts. Well, the truth is that's how the divine works also. But it is our true self that the divine is trying to awaken, and Satan is trying to take us away from that. So when Master spoke to Boone, he didn't say, that was a great letter. Those were really good ideas in there. Wow, you're really on to something here. He said it was a very well-written, Satan-induced letter. So if Boone was listening, and Master said, Swami said, there was no sarcasm. There was genuine appreciation. Wow, you really have embraced wrong thinking, and you've expressed it extremely effectively. You're very good at writing. So that's quite different than acting as if, anything you think is just fine. And I don't, that's why I object to the idea that, and I don't want this idea of Masters to be misunderstood. Master was very definite about where our happiness would come from and what would be right for us. But he still, and think of it like this. This is how I repeatedly say it, because it has become so fundamental to my ability to stay out of the satanic thought that I've failed, which is Master has been through exactly the position that I'm in. Every avatar has to go through every stage of delusion. Whatever stage of delusion I'm in, Master knows it perfectly well. Been there, done that. Exactly. So he appreciates, he understands how we end up thinking this is a good idea. And that's where he appreciates and respects it. I understand. You're being very sincere, but you've gotten caught in this. You've gotten caught in a satanic influence. And he just says it. He said it out loud to Boone. He might not be able to say it out loud to everyone, but nonetheless, he never loses track of it. He doesn't encourage us in a wrong direction. See, that's what happens if you just act as if, oh, this is a great idea, when you know perfectly well it's a disastrous idea. But nonetheless, and this gets subtle. You can, well, I'll put it like this. Here's how I'll think about it. The most important, the most important continuing reality that Swamiji had to maintain in his working with all of us was he had to preserve the friendship. And I believe I wrote about this in Light Bearer. I might have written about it in Swami Kriyananda's We've Known Him, I'm not sure. But I began to see over many years of working with Swamiji that above all, he had to preserve the friendship with people. He had to hold their trust. They had to feel that he was on their side. So Swami never failed to be aware of what direction people's energy was going, but he was very strategic in how he responded to it. For example, there's a story that I believe is in Swami Kriyananda's We Have Known Him. This person had a determination to do something that Swamiji knew would end in a great deal of suffering. It would be one of those, it was a poisoned honey. It's like, it seemed like it would be sweet, but Swami knew it would be catastrophic. As it happened, I knew that I knew what was going on, and I called Swami and I said, so-and-so is going to want to talk to you, and here's what they're going to want to talk to you about. Later, Swami said to me, I'm so glad you told me, because that gave him time. And as soon as the conversation started, he knew where it was going. So the person presented that they were going to drink this poisoned honey, and they thought it was sweet. They didn't know it was poisoned. Swami saw that the person was absolutely determined on that course of action, and that if Swami opposed that course of action, it would put the person in an impossible position, because their desires were simply too strong. So Swami very carefully, and he was very careful about what he said. He never spoke against the decision. He never exactly spoke for it, but he never spoke against it. So when the person said, well, you do bless me, sir, don't you? Swami said, oh, of course I bless you. I always bless you. The person then came out of the conversation with Swami and said, oh, Swami favors what I'm going to do. Now, of course, if you had really been listening, you would have heard that Swami never endorsed the decision, but he endorsed the friendship. And so as a result, the person drank the poisoned honey. It was sweet for a while, and then it proved catastrophic, just as he knew. He had wanted to spare them that karma, but it wasn't destiny. So, but in the end, when everything went terrible, there was no barrier between Swami and the person. The friendship had been maintained. Another example from Swami Kriyananda's We've Known Him is that there was this person who conceived of, this was in the early years of Ananda, they conceived of the idea that they were going to move to another place and start a community in that new place. The project was not destined to succeed. And Swami knew it was not destined to succeed, but he said about the person who was proposing it, they are in a rebellious mood. And if I try to restrain the person at this point, they will simply become angry with me. So Swami encouraged the project. And for the next 10 years, every time the person would come to Swami to talk about the project, Swami, and I listened very, very carefully. I would listen, and Swami would explore for a moment to see if the person was ready to give up the idea. When he saw the person was still committed to the idea, then Swami would start helping them. He would start making suggestions. You could do this, you could do that. And And that would just go on. Every time they would intermittently meet, and almost always when they met, I was there. So I was able to listen. I watched Swami do exactly the same thing each time. Test the water, see the temperature of the water, choose the friendship. So the person always felt that Swami was supporting them and that they were friends and he was helping, which in fact he was. And then finally, after 10 years, when Swami explored whether or not maybe it was time to give up the project, the man said, "Yeah, I think I'm ready to come back to the village." Swami said, "Oh, that would be wonderful." Just like that. "Oh, that would be wonderful." Never a word, never nothing. "That would be wonderful." So the person came back. There was no complex. There was no loss of friendship, nothing. Just a certain amount of time was spent. But Swami was able to hold them the whole time. Now, sometimes, and I say this now, years later, Swami would send one of us to deliver the hard news so that because my relationship with a person or somebody else's relationship with a person was expendable, but some message could be delivered, and then if they didn't like it, they could appeal to Swami, and he would still be, in place, even though I or whoever had delivered the hard message might become the bad guy for a while. And sometimes that worked. Sometimes they could hear it from a person like me because they were free to reject me, and that made them more open to it. And even then, when the message was delivered, I would, if it was I would try to deliver it in the way Swami would, which is test the water, see how much openness there is. But you respect and appreciate. You can respect and appreciate why a person feels the way they do, that they have a right to their free will, that they're a child of God and they're doing the best that they can. That's what you're respecting. You're not respecting the fact that Satan has captured them with a really bad idea. I mean, there's nothing to respect in that. And the delusion that a person is caught in is separate from the person. And you can appreciate how delusion catches you and not think you're so stupid, only somebody was stupid who was do that. You're so weak, you should just raise your energy and change your attitude, like that's not necessarily what you can say to a person because it can sound very disrespectful. You should just be different than you are. You're such a weakling. How could you fall for this? Master would never do that. There wasn't a hint of sarcasm. But he did say that it was the best letter that Satan had ever written to me. So that's making it very clear what Master really thought about what this man was thinking, but he did it in a very appreciative way. And I've been on the receiving end of that also from Swamiji, where he just saw that I was fixed. And well, okay, here we go. But because Swami respected my right to explore and find out for myself, um, the friendship was never injured. Now, you see, you have to realize, especially between a guru and his disciple. Well, when Swamiji was at Mount Washington, and it might have been actually Boone, because he was the one who had lots of different visions, or maybe it was Norman Paulson, I'm not sure. But one of Swami's fellow disciples had a vision of being Master's disciple on the was it an island? Was Lemuria an island, which is like what you would almost say mythical, 80,000 years ago, something like that. And Swamiji, when he heard that, he went to Master and he said, "You know, was I your disciple 80,000 years ago?" Because the implication of that is, why am I not liberated yet? Why am I still incarnating here and being your disciple again? Now, I feel that Swami was a Jivan Mukta when he was born, which is to say, he could have been fully liberated at any moment. He was just continuing, as Master said, leaving a little karma so that he could come back and help people. Master said that Swami would be fully liberated in the incarnation that just finished. These are all mysteries way beyond me. But still, the way it played out is Swami said to Master, was I your disciple? Have I been your disciple for 80,000 years? And Master said, it's been a long time, that's all I'll say. And then Swamiji said, essentially, am I at the bottom of the class? He said, am I the only one? Oh no, Master said, he said, this happens, this is what it takes. He said, desire for name or fame. And then Swami said Master kind of let those words sit for a minute, or one thing or another, draws you away again and again. Swami in this incarnation had an absolute horror of becoming of falling because of egoic involvement in name or fame. When Master told Swamiji that he was going to have to be a public figure, that he was going to have to teach in public and work in that way, Swami had an absolute horror of doing that. And he said to Master at a certain point, I don't want to just become egoically trapped. And Master very seriously said to Swami, you will never fall because of ego. And that was greatly reassuring to Swami, because he felt somewhere in his past that had been an issue. And when Master was talking about how long it takes, he used the words name and fame. Swami said it meant nothing to him in this lifetime at all. It was a been there, done that. And I'm just not going to get caught by it. But one thing or another draws you away again and again. So the masters are very steady with this. They don't have a panic reaction, which is one of the reasons why they can just call things what they are. Oh yes, now you're getting drawn away again. Master had an exchange with Senor Cuaron, who was the leader of the SRF group in Mexico. And Cuaron said to Master had said to Cuaron, I lost track of you for a few lifetimes, but I'm not going to lose track of you again. And Cuaron, Swamiji said, would sometimes say to Master, remember your promise. And Master says, I'll remember, I'm not going to lose you again. But you can see how much, what a story is that? How many incarnations, how much suffering, like Daniel Boone being that close to a great master, having all that choice and then getting drawn away. But one disciple in that incarnation who got drawn away would be back very soon. But because of Daniel's attitude toward himself, it was going to take him longer. He would have to overcome the desire and then overcome the shame, is actually the word, of his failure. So the masters are very, very patient. They're very understanding, and they're very strategic. Master was completely respectful and supportive, appreciative of Daniel, but he called what he was doing satanic. And, this is the amazing sensitivity of it. In Swami Kriyananda, as we have known him, I talked about this experience I had with Swamiji when he went to speak at a church of religious science that was operated by a friend of his. I told the friend's story about meeting Swami, I think also in that book. He ran a church of religious science in Reno, Nevada. His name escapes me at the moment. And he would invite Swamiji periodically to come and speak to his congregation. And Swami had a strong tie with the minister, so he would go and speak. And it was so interesting because the people in that church were very sincere, but for the most part, I would say all of them, they weren't really at the point in their own spiritual life where they could really become Kriya Yogic disciples of Master. So Swami could give them only so much. But after the talk was over and Swami was very magnetic, he stood in the front to greet the people in the congregation. It was small. There were maybe like 30 or 50 people there at the most. And Swami, there was something extraordinary about the way Swami was that evening. He was extremely elevated, I think because of the minister primarily, but in his friendship with him. But Swami was extremely elevated, and he was really on another plane of consciousness, which he would move in and out of that at different times. And then he stood there, and whenever Swami was greeting people or in the room, I would just station myself as close to as close to him as I could be that was appropriate. If I was hosting, if it was our church and I was hosting him, I could stand right next to Swami. Someone else's church, I would just take a nearby seat because I had no role. But I just watched Swamiji. And all of these people came up and they were all very deeply touched. And this is what I saw. Swami saw each one and respected and appreciated them exactly for where they were. And essentially, he would give them as much as their little receptacle could hold. As much of the consciousness he had, he would give it to them, knowing that in another lifetime, and in another lifetime, and in another lifetime, their consciousness will expand, partly because of the contact with him, and then more will be possible. And he just stood there, and Swami. What the point was, Swami greeted everyone with the same total unconditional love. It was perfectly evident. I mean, even I could see the different levels of consciousness that people were bringing to him. He gave them as much as they were able to, as much of his vibration as their vibration could meld with. But there was no. This is the part. There was perfect clarity on Swami's part, and there was no judgment, no sarcasm, no impatience, nothing. Just like this. And, he just did that for all 30 or 40 or 50 people. Just greeted them, gave them his heart. They took in as much as they could. As many as received him, to them gave he the power. Jesus walking through the crowd in Jerusalem, even though everybody's crowding up to him, Jesus suddenly says, "Someone touched me." His disciples said, "Everybody's touching you." Jesus said, "No, someone touched me. I felt power go out from me," which is to say, the one who touched him had the magnetism within, it was a woman, as it turned out, within herself, to be able to receive a great deal of what Jesus was emanating. And Jesus could feel the magnetism of that one disciple. And that's the story where the woman had for 12 years, had a hemorrhage. She touched the hem of his garment and she was healed. And Jesus said to her, by your faith, it's your faith that has healed you, because she'd made her receptacle large enough. Now, that particular experience that I had with Reno and Swami, I will add to this, that before I published that book, Swami and I sat side by side, and he read every word. And he did not correct it. I mean, we both knew what we were doing, because I wrote that book without, he hadn't seen what I'd written until that point. But he saw it, he read it, I had interpreted what had happened, and he confirmed it. That's exactly what happened. Because even some of the stories, when he would finish them and didn't correct them, I'd say, "Oh, good. I'm glad you agree." So it was explicit between us. It wasn't like I projected that thought. But that's what Master is talking about. He's not talking about blinding ourselves to people's reality. He's talking about preserving the friendship despite what they're doing. But you can't support people. You can't go forward and support people's wrong actions. That's not friendship. It just isn't. We're not being friends with people when we sort of give them energy to head off in the wrong direction. It's delicate. It's very delicate. Like that person who said to Swami, "Well, you bless me, don't you?" "Of course I bless you." Swami was effusive. "Of course I bless you." But he was also very careful. He was very careful in what he said. So it's a fine line. It's not just a kind of airheadedness is the only word I can use. As Swami uses the phrase, we want to be open-minded, but not so open-minded that our brains fall out. And we also have to be absolutely sincere. You have to be absolutely sincere and absolutely truthful. And earlier in these broadcasts, I've talked about the wonderful, delightful challenge of being absolutely sincere and absolutely truthful and being appreciative and respectful. It's much trickier than just saying, "Oh, whatever you do is fine, it's going to work out great," when you know it won't. But you want to preserve the friendship above all. So I hope that's helpful. God bless you, my friends.